We talked in the last video as to how the frequency of the sound wave affects the pitch that we hear. But we also talked something about the energy that sound waves carry, because I mentioned that if you're in a room with a really loud music, it feels like everything is vibrating because the energy of those sound waves is actually going into the walls and the floor, and it's making everything vibrate. What aspect of a wave is it that causes that to happen? Well, it's actually the amplitude of the wave. The amplitude of the wave is directly proportional to the energy. So the bigger the amplitude, the bigger the energy of the wave, and the higher the volume is going to be. Okay, so when you hear sounds, what happens is that sound goes into your ear, and it actually makes your tympanic membrane in your ear vibrate. And there are some diagrams in your book as to what the inside of your ear looks like. I don't expect you to know all of the details of all of the diagrams in the book as far as all of the anatomical structures of your ear. I figure you'll probably hit that in health class at some point. But what you do need to understand is this. Those sound waves make your tympanic membrane vibrate, just like sound waves are going to make anything vibrate. And so when the sound gets too high and your tympanic membrane vibrates a whole lot, that's when your ears start to hurt, and you tend to cover your ears because the sound is hurting your ears. It's because the tympanic membrane is vibrating so violently that it's actually causing pain. If you consistently listen to a lot of loud music, or like there are some factory workers, my dad worked in a factory where he was constantly surrounded by loud sounds, and it wasn't until much later in his career when they realized that these guys really ought to be wearing hearing protection. The cochlea, which is what's further inside and translates a lot of those vibrations of the tympanic membrane to the brain, a lot of those really sensitive cells get damaged and will die. And once they do, those cells can't be replaced. And so then you end up with a loss of hearing. So folks like your probably great-grandparents who worked in loud factory conditions suffered a loss of hearing because they were just constantly surrounded and barraged by these loud sounds and high energy waves that ended up damaging some of those sensitive cells in their ears. So that should just hopefully be a reminder that if you are working with loud power tools, if you like to listen to music, especially if you like to put earbuds in, you want to make sure you don't have it cranked up too loud, because once you damage those cells, you can't ever go back and cause them to regrow again. Now, sound is measured in a unit called a decibel. And what is interesting about decibels is that it's really similar to the way that earthquake waves are measured on the Richter scale. So if you've studied that, this will probably sound familiar to you, because it's not a direct relationship. It's actually an exponential relationship. And again, that exponential relationship is one that if you haven't had algebra, you won't understand it exactly, but let me explain it this way to you. Every increase in 10 decibels means that you're going to have 10 times the increase in the intensity of the sound. So if I would go up, if I increase the sound level by 20 decibels, what that means is that I'm going to have 10 times 10. So I'm going to have, this number is a 2, so I'm going to have 10 times 10, or 100 times an increase in the sound intensity, in how loud it sounds in the volume. Now, we can't really measure how loud something seems to us, but we can measure the intensity with decibels. Okay, so let's do another example so that becomes a little bit more obvious. A vacuum cleaner has just a regular standard old run-of-the-mill vacuum cleaner generally makes a noise of about 60 decibels. Okay, a rifle firing, obviously that's pretty loud, and I know that when my boys fire off their rifles, they always have sound protection on. A rifle firing has a sound level of about 140 decibels. So what's the difference between those two? Well, if I take 140 and I subtract 60, that's an 80 decibel difference. But what does that actually mean? Well, what that means is that I have to take 10 times itself 8 times. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tens times themselves to figure out the difference in intensity. So what that's going to be is if I take 10 times itself 8 times, that's going to give me a 1 with 8 zeros after it. So it's going to look like this. So I'm going to have 100 times the intensity of the sound from a rifle firing as I do from listening to a vacuum cleaner. So even though the decibel difference may not look that much, because for every increase of 10, it goes up 10 times, that leads to a really big increase in intensity. Probably the most intense sound that we can potentially hear is a sonic boom. And they mentioned on the very first page of your chapter, they had a picture of a jet that was surpassing the speed of sound as it was moving. But I want to explain to you exactly what happens and why that sonic boom is produced. So when a jet flies, it produces pressure waves in the air. And so if it were sitting still, these pressure waves would look kind of like the ripples in a pond, and they would all be equally spaced from each other. But because the jet is flying in this direction, he's flying into the waves, and so they're closer at the front than they are back behind him because he's flying into them. It would be sort of like if you can picture, have you ever seen a duck swimming on a pond? He's making ripples in the pond, but as he's moving this way, the ripples in front of him are much closer together than the ripples are behind him. So it's the same type of thing with this airplane. The pressure waves would have been evenly spaced, but because the plane is going this way, they tend to be more closely crowded at the front. Now, when we say Mach 1 means the speed of sound. And so this jet, in this particular picture, is flying at less than Mach 1, or less than the speed of sound. And so the pressure waves are going to look like this. As the jet increases his speed, he tends to catch up to the waves, and so then they really all bunch up at the front because he's moving forward at the same pace that the pressure waves are moving forward because they are traveling at the speed of sound. Once the jet exceeds Mach 1 or goes faster than the speed of sound, he starts to outrun these pressure waves that he is creating, and what this results in is you have this cone shape of all these shock waves, and then what happens is when this cone shape of waves reaches your ears, it makes what's called a sonic boom. Now, these have so much energy in them that they can damage people's hearing, they can damage buildings because sound waves are going to transfer energy. It's not just a sound, they're transferring energy. And so sonic booms can also damage buildings or other structures that may be in the area. So if jets are going to fly over the speed of sound or over Mach 1, then they really need to be out over the ocean so that they're not going to damage people's hearing, or so they're not going to damage the structures that are available there. So I wanted to make sure that you got this picture description to help you understand what a sonic boom is, because the picture on the opening pages of your chapter really is kind of cool, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you understand what's happening and what's causing that kind of ring there around that airplane. Okay, so important points today are that the higher the amplitude of the wave, the higher the energy, and the higher the volume. And then I'll be asking you to do some problems similar to the one that I did here, in figuring out the difference in sound intensity based on the difference in decibels of two different sounds.